My name is Kayla Cowan. I'm going to be introducing Fred Morsell. Don't be mad because I'm going to mess up a lot, kind of. Fred Morsell's professional acting career spans more than 38 years and includes seasons of the Actors Theater of Louisville, the Repertory Theater of Lincoln Center, the New York Shakespeare Festival, the MacArthur Theater of Princeton, and other regional theaters throughout America, where among other roles he has starred as Macbeth and Othello. He has appeared in both on and off Broadway in numerous plays and musicals and has an extensive background in film and television. His television credits include the role of Frederick Douglass in the CBS bicentennial production We the Women as appears in the Hill St. Blues, LA Law, Scarecrow, and Miss King, and soaps such as General Hospital, Another World, and One Life to Live. A lyric baritone, Mr. Morsell has sung leading roles in 20 operas for several years in Los Angeles. Mr. Morsell was the weekend announcer for the Los Angeles PBS affiliate KCET. Acclaimed across the United States for his portrayal of Frederick Douglass, Mr. Morsell performed at many of the National's Frederick Douglass in 1994. He was featured on the Bill Moore's Journal, delivered Frederick Douglass' last great speech, The Lesson of the Hour. Of that performance, February 1994, the New York Times said, even 100 years later, sadly enough, the speech goes right to the very heart of the Black experience in America. The standing ovation given to Mr. Morsell, whose sonorous voice stems in large parts from his background a lyric baritone, is clearly a deservingly heartfelt. In addition, Mr. Morsell has performed his play, presenting Mr. Frederick Douglass at many other nationally recognized sites such as Harper's Ferry, Gettysburg, and the Seneca Falls National Historic Parks, as well as Chautauqua in New York State. Fred Morsell began working on Frederick Douglass in the fall of 1984 when a Black clergyman friend asked him to develop an alternative program for inner city youth which would help them find a sense of self-respect and belief in themselves. As an antidote for the frustrations of drugs and the hopelessness in which they are living, Fred read Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself. The book, in his words, practically blew me away. It read like a screenplay because Douglas' desperate description of events of his life were so visual, intense, and dramatic. The images literally jumped off the page at me. I thought to myself, wouldn't it be wonderful just to read Frederick Douglass's words to a group of 9 or 10-year-old kids and see if they could become inspired to do with their lives what Mr. Douglass did with his? Since 1984, Fred Morsell had become a scholar on the lifetimes of Frederick Douglass. His performance, one-man, 2-act play presenting Mr. Frederick Douglass for colleges, civil groups, churches, and regional theaters tours the country with school versions of the full-length play for public, private, and jail schools. The delivered speeches by Frederick Douglass in churches, at universities for the public occasion, it leads seminars and workshops to improve on Black and white relations through his nonprofit 501c3 corporation, Fenera and Corporations. Mr. Morsell has been an actor, director, and teacher with the Terry Shenburn Studios in New York City since 1970. He is a graduate of Dixon College and holds master's degrees in theater arts from Wayne State University. I'm not going to.
Should I put it on? Is that going to be okay? Put it in my pocket? Well, good afternoon. And thank you very much, Kayla. It's a pleasure for me to be here and to see so many young people here at Franklin Middle School. I suppose it's named after Benjamin Franklin, is that correct? I don't want to be too wrong then, that's good. I got into Springfield late last night. I came here to be here for a couple of days this week so that tomorrow evening I can do a program on the life of Frederick Douglass at the University of Illinois here in Springfield, and then on Thursday evening at the Abraham Lincoln Association annual banquet. The remarks that I will be making on Thursday evening are very special remarks. I consider it a great privilege to have come to this city. I think I envy every single one of you here, at least a little bit, because you are here in a city upon whose streets, in whose buildings, the person I consider to be the greatest president this nation has ever had lived. Frederick Douglass, many of you may not know, was born in the year 1818. He never knew his actual birthday because slaves were not allowed to learn how to read, and they were forbidden to ask questions about their lives, because if they did, their slave owners would beat them, in some cases kill them. People have sometimes asked me, young people, junior high school students, your age, elementary school students, high school students, college students, many adults have wanted to know, what was it like to be a slave? I, Fred Morsell, an actor, cannot tell you, but I can, through drama, tell you, because Frederick Douglass made very clear what slavery was like. What I say to you young people is, if you can recall a time in your life, maybe a few months ago, a year ago, 5 years ago, when something truly frightened you, think back to that experience. Think back to the circumstances that led to that experience. And then imaginatively multiply that experience that lasted hopefully no more than a few minutes, multiply it by 24 hours, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, for 50 or 60 years of your life. You will then have an understanding of what it meant to be a slave in America. People often wonder why slaves were terrified to look a person in the eye. Why would slaves always look down at the ground? Why would slaves be terrified to open their mouths and speak to any white person who asked them a question? The reason for that was because they could then be accused of being impudent, proudful, prideful, and for that crime they would be whipped and on occasion shot to death. Slavery was not a story in a book. It was a reality for millions of black people in this country. Slavery has been a reality for people of all races across this globe ever since the beginning of time. Now, Frederick Bailey was born on the eastern shore of Maryland in a log cabin in which his grandmother, Betsy Bailey, his grandfather, Isaac Bailey, lived. Their daughter, Harriet, had Frederick in their house, their one-room cabin. When he was approximately 5 days old, I emphasize days, not weeks, not years, 5 days old, his mother was taken away from him and sent to work on a farm about 15 miles away. He was raised by his grandmammy, Betsy, he called her, his grandpappy, Isaac. His mother perhaps visited him 4 or 5 times before she died. In order to visit him, she had to work because she was a field hand, 8 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours a day. And at night, when the other slaves would retire to the slave quarter to prepare their evening meal, or perhaps go to sleep, Harriet Bailey, his mother, would walk through the woods, the 12 miles or so, to the cabin where her parents lived and where Frederick was living. Might take her as long as 3 hours or more to cover that 12-mile distance. When she got to where he was asleep. She would wake him up, lift him up off the straw mat, which was his bed, place him on her lap, and hold him tightly against her body, rocking him gently, kissing him. And then, after they had talked for a few moments, she would lie him back down on the straw mat, I should say lay him back down on the straw mat, lie down next to her, and hold him tightly until he fell asleep. When he woke up in the morning, she was gone, because she had those same 12 miles to retrace before dawn the next morning. If she were late in her master's fields by as little as 5 minutes, she would have been whipped. Frederick stated many times, for his mother to work all day in the hot sun, 8, 10, 12 hours, walk 24 miles at night through the woods, work all the next day another 10 or 12 hours, sometimes going for as long as 40 or more hours, 2 full days without any sleep or rest. And he would ask, for what? Just to come and spend 1, maybe 2 hours with him. When he was about 7 years old, she died. No one told him that she was sick. No one told him that she had died. No one asked him to come to the burial. She had been dead, he says, many, many months before he had even learned that she had died. And in his own words, he says, never having enjoyed to any considerable extent her soothing presence, her tender and watchful care, I received the tidings of her death with much the same emotions as I should probably have received at the death of a stranger. And that's virtually the last word that Frederick Douglass ever says about his mother. When you read those words and you think about what he is saying, he is doing everything he can to push away from him that sense of pain, sadness, shock, and horror of never having known his mother. That was the reality of American slavery for, as the great emancipator, the native son of this city, Abraham Lincoln, stated, 250 years of unrequited toil. Actually more like 270 years of slavery in America. It is what made and allowed slavery to succeed. Separate families. Do not permit a slave child to develop a sense of trust in his mother, father, brother, sister, grandparents, or whomever. The idea was to destroy all that trust so that the only person the slave could respond to, would listen to, would obey, would be the slave master. And it worked for more than 270 years. People all over this nation did everything they could to bring about an end to what they called the diabolical system of American slavery. But until that happened, until those people who call themselves abolitionists began to do their work, Frederick Douglass, or Frederick Bailey, experienced the worst kind of human behavior. He loved his grandmother deeply. But when she took him to the plantation and left him there and never told him that that was what she was going to do, he felt a sense of betrayal that he never ever forgot. The bitterness and the anger that he experienced as a result of that betrayal is what fed his life until he died on February 20th, 1895. When he was 6 years old, he was on the plantation. When he was 8 years old, 2 years later, his master, Captain Aaron Anthony, who was also the chief of all the overseers who ran the plantation of one of the wealthiest men in this country, Colonel Edward Lloyd of Maryland, twice elected governor, once the senator from that state. Frederick was sent by his master, Captain Aaron Anthony, whom he learned while he was on the plantation was in all likelihood also his real father. Because you see, Harriet Bailey was a very dark, black-skinned woman. Frederick Bailey was fair-skinned like I am, my complexion right now, which is one of the reasons why I am able to perform his life. How could he become and have skin color like this? When I do a performance in a high school or a middle school, I say to the people, to the young people, my father was a white man. My mother was very black in skin color. And then I challenged them to understand how that could happen. It was very common during slavery. Slave masters often would unite with their slave women to create slave babies, because the more slave babies there were on a plantation, the more money and wealth the slave owner had. Can you understand that, ladies and gentlemen? His master and his father, when Douglas or Frederick was 8 years old, sent her to the city of Baltimore to live with relatives of the master. He was going there to become a companion to those relatives' son, who was a little younger than Frederick. One day, Frederick came home from taking Tommy to school, and he overheard his mistress in her parlor reading aloud. When he inquired what she was doing, she said, "I'm reading aloud from my Bible. Would you like to do what I can do?" He said, "I don't know, ma'am. Should I?" And she said, "Let me show you." So Sophia Auld had Frederick sit down next to her. She opened up her Bible, and she commenced to do something with Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. Is there anyone here who can tell me what it was Sophia Auld did? Yes, sir.
Taught him to read.
Taught him how to read. That's a wonderful answer, sir. Unfortunately, you are wrong. No, she did not teach him how to read. Sir, let me ask you another question, if I may. What is your name, incidentally? Chris? Before a person can learn how to read, they have to learn something before that. What's the first thing they have to learn, Chris?
Right.
No! We do not learn how to write before we learn how to read. What's the first thing a child, a student has to learn before he or she can learn how to read or write? Yes, ma'am. Hold it, please. Be courteous to this young lady because she is correct. What did she do to him?
Teach him.
She taught him the alphabet. That's the first thing he learned. And then she started to teach him how to spell a word or two. And as soon as she began to teach him how to spell a few words, her husband, Frederick's master, Hugh Auld, came home from work suddenly and unexpectedly. And when he saw what his wife was doing with this young slave boy, he became enraged. He ran at her, grabbed the Bible out of her hands, and threw it across the wall, breaking some items that were on the shelf. And he said to her, "It is unlawful as well as unsafe to teach a slave to read. If you teach a slave to read, it will forever unfit him to be a slave." Those words are very important. If you teach a slave to read, it will forever unfit him to be a slave. Frederick Bailey, at the age of 8 years old, never forgot those words. His master then stormed out of the house. Mrs. Auld sat quietly in her chair for 5 minutes. She was stunned that her husband had been so angry at her. She got up, walked to the door, but before she left the room, she turned and looked at Frederick and said, "If you ever feel hungry, as I have told you before, I want you to feel very free. Go into the kitchen, help yourself to bread or cookies, whatever you find. I don't ever want you to be hungry," she said. And with that, she left the room. Frederick Bailey stood there in a state of shock. He says the last time he saw a white man that angry, he had lashed a slave on the plantation nearly to death. Now, of course, when Hugh Auld told his wife not to teach him how to read, he did not call him a slave. He used a word that unfortunately seems to be extremely common in American society today. It is a derogatory way of referring to anyone who's a member of the Negro race. All of you know what that word is, and I don't want to hear a word of it. It's very common today. You hear it in the streets. You hear black people calling themselves that word. You listen to these ridiculous songs called rap music, where they use this word all the time, and everybody thinks it's cool and funny and harmless. I'm here to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that word and all derogatory words are anything but harmless. They are totally destructive because they destroy the sense of self-worth of anyone who hears that word or uses it. That is why I will not use it today. And I say to people wherever I meet them, if I ever hear anyone using that word, they will deal with me. And I mean that as a promise. Do not ever use those derogatory words or ways of referring to someone you don't know. Always treat them with one word. Begins with an R, ends with a T, and the middle letters are E-S-P-E-C. Respect. Frederick Bailey, at the age of 8 years old, knew what it felt like to be called that word. But he also could not forget what he had just heard. The master say, if you teach a slave to read, it will forever unfit him to be a slave. And he thought about those words for the next several days. And when he was waiting for Tommy after school, about 4 days later, he suddenly thought about that. He said, I have to learn how to read because I do not want to be a slave. But how can I learn how to read, he said. And then he saw something fascinating. He saw the white boys who lived on their street coming toward him. They're coming out of school. He thought to himself, those white boys, they can go to school. Of course, he, as a slave boy, could not go to school. Thought to himself, those white boys, they know how to read. I, of course, do not know how to read, he thought. But then he remembered the most important thing. He remembered what his mistress had just said when she left the room. If you ever feel hungry, help yourself to what? Bread. And he realized that these white boys who were his friends came from families where their masters and their daddies who worked at the shipyards did not make enough money to feed them well. They were always complaining about how hungry they were. But he was never always hungry. In fact, he was always filled with food. So he thought to himself, I think I see something here. The white boys, they can go to school. I cannot go to school. The white boys, they know how to read. I do not know how to read. The white boys, they're always hungry. I, however, am not always hungry. So what do you think he did? Yes, sir.
He got the bread from the closet.
He gave them his bread. Very good answer, sir. And over a period of nearly 2 years, he gave away a great deal of Sophia All's bread. But he received that much greater bread of knowledge. Frederick Bailey then learned how to write, and he learned how to speak well. And he discovered that in learning how to read, write, and speak well, he was able to begin to control his own thoughts. And when he could control his own thoughts, he was very close to being able to control his own what? Somebody just said it. His mind. And one of the things that Frederick Douglass always said throughout his life, and if you have a piece of paper, you might want to write it down. If your mind is not free, if you do not have control over your own mind, you will always be somebody's slave. But if you can control your own mind, you will be forever free. And the key to controlling your mind is to learn how to read and write well enough so that you can control, as someone over here said a moment ago, your own destiny. That is the message. Frederick Bailey was a slave for another 12 years. At the age of 20 years old in 1838, he was successful in escaping from slavery through the help of a free black woman by the name of Anna Murray. They fell in love with each other. Anna helped him to escape. And on the 15th of September, 1838, the two of them were married. They moved to the city of New Bedford, Massachusetts. And in October of 1841, 3 years later, Frederick Douglass became a speaker for the abolitionist cause. A speaker, a lecturer, a fighter for the abolition of the slaves. He lived through the 1840s, the 1850s, and all of a sudden, in the late 1860s, just before South Carolina seceded from the Union, he became conscious of a man by the name of Abraham Lincoln. And when Lincoln ran for the presidency, Douglass was not a very happy man. He said, I don't think he's a very good person. I don't think he can think very well. He can't make decisions. He's slow-witted. Frederick Douglass did not think very much of Abraham Lincoln, your favorite son, until January 1st, 1863, when Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And then in March of that same year, he authorized Governor Andrews of Massachusetts to form the Massachusetts 54th Regiment. Anybody here ever see a movie entitled Glory? Put your hands down. Very good. It's a very wonderful movie about the Massachusetts 54th. A very well-known American actor by the name Morgan Freeman played a role in that movie. The role he played was that of the sergeant major of that regiment. But the people who made that movie made two mistakes. One, they did not make it clear that the part that Morgan Freeman was playing, the sergeant major of that regiment, was actually Frederick Douglass's oldest son, Lewis Henry Douglass. It was Lewis Henry Douglass who was the sergeant major of that regiment. He did not die at Fort Wagner in July of that year. The second mistake they made, and if you will allow me to say it, is they just simply did not ask me to be in the movie. I just say that as a silly thing to say. But in August of that same year, 1863, Frederick Douglass had an opportunity to meet President Abraham Lincoln. And as he says in his autobiographies, and a number of his speeches, as I will be repeating this Thursday night, as soon as he walked into the office of President Lincoln, who was sitting behind a desk, he stood up, came toward him. He said, as soon as I looked into his eyes, I knew that I could trust him. And over the next 2 years, Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass developed not only a great respect for each other, but a very abiding friendship. 7 weeks after the assassination, Douglass spoke in New York, giving the eulogy that I will be delivering this Thursday night. And in it, Douglass speaks about what Abraham Lincoln meant to the American people, why they loved him, why they honored him, why they still maintain in this city of Springfield, Illinois, his statue and his memory and his grave. It is because Abraham Lincoln, because he could be trusted, because the American people knew he understood them as they were. They felt that when he was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, that they had lost a member of their family. And they come back to visit him, to remember him every day, every year, because it brings them back in contact not only with a relative, but with themselves. When they look at Abraham Lincoln and what he did for the black man and woman, what he did in restoring this nation to unity, they see he represented the best that is found in every person, living or dead. And I look upon that as a great privilege, as I started to say earlier, to be able to come here and walk these streets. And I do feel a certain jealousy of all of you, because you can walk around these streets every day. I have to come here from some other state. Respect your history here, and if you do that, you will truly respect yourselves. And I know our time is getting close, so I am very happy at this point. If anyone has a question or two that they would like to ask me, I'll be very happy to try. Yes, sir. Yes. Pardon me? What state did I come from? I live in the state of Montana. Yes. Yes. No, hold 1 second. This young man here, yeah. To me or to Frederick Douglass? To me? The gentleman asked me if anyone in my life has been mean to me. Because of what, the hair? Because of my skin color. I don't think I've ever been asked that question in the nearly 30 years I've been doing this work. The young man asked me a very important question. I'm going to give you the answer. You may not want to hear it. He asked me if anybody had ever been mean to me because of my skin color. The answer is yes. I can think of one experience. It occurred about 1956. I was 16 years old. I was in high school living in Brooklyn, New York. A Saturday night in the fall of that year, my father wanted me to go and get my hair cut. I never liked getting my hair cut, which is probably why I let it grow right now. And where we lived in Brooklyn, there were very few black people around. So I walked out to Flatbush Avenue, and I found a barber shop. 3 white men were in there. It was closed. I mean, there were no customers in there. And I stood there for a minute thinking, I wonder if I can go in here. But Dad said I got to get a haircut. So I opened up the door and I stood there and I said, good afternoon, or good evening rather, it was about 7 o'clock in the evening. I said, good evening. And the 3 men stopped and looked at me. And I said, can I get my hair cut? And there was a little bit of a pause, and one of them said to me, well, I don't think I know how to cut your hair. I said, it's not hard, just cut it. And then he looked at the other 2 men, And he said, okay, come on, sit down. So I sat down in the chair. He put the apron over my body. He took the electric clippers and he placed them back here at the back of my head and ran them straight down to the front. So there was a big bald spot right there. And then he stood away and he looked at me and he said, there, you see, I told you I didn't know how to cut your hair. So I said, yes, I understand. And I then picked my coat up and walked home. Now in 1956-57, my father was the Associate Executive Director of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in New York City. He was Roy Wilkins' associate. My dad knew Martin Luther King Jr. I did not, but I knew Thurgood Marshall. I knew Baird Rustin. I knew A. Philip Randolph, and I certainly knew Roy Wilkins. And I showed my dad what had happened. He was very angry. It's one of the few times in my life I ever saw him so angry that he didn't open his mouth or say anything. I don't remember how my mother was. I know she was upset. My father went to the coat closet and got his coat and said, I'm going back there. I said, you want me to go with you? He said, no. And he walked back to that barbershop, which was still open. And he walked inside and he said to those three men, that young boy you just cut his hair the way you did was my son. My name is Dr. John Albert Morsell. I am the Associate Executive Director of the NAACP, and you will regret what you have just done. They said, we're sorry, we didn't know, we were just kidding around. My dad said, there is nothing funny about what you did, and you are not kidding around. And with that, he turned to walk out of the store. And they said, please, wait a minute, please, sir, don't go. Would you please ask your son to come back? I'll take care of his hair, I'll do it correctly. My father said, no, I don't want you to cut it at all. But I will send my son back here, and I want you to apologize to him. My dad came home. It only took about 10 minutes. Had me put my coat on and walk back to the store again with him. And I walked in there, and they said, we wanted to apologize to you. I was a 17-year-old, 16-year-old black kid living in Brooklyn, New York. And these three racist bigots apologized to me on the basis of what my father said to them. I have never forgotten that experience. And that was over 60 years ago. You can experience prejudice anywhere. It is how you deal with it that makes the difference. My father showed me in that moment that the way to deal with it is in a way that's going to cause the least physical harm. You get my point? And does that answer your question, sir? Anyone else? Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. In the pink. Her question is a great one. If I could meet Frederick Douglass, what would I say to him? You want to know what I would say to him, really? If Frederick Douglass was suddenly sitting right here and stood up right next to this young lady in the blonde hair, I would step over this gentleman here and over this young lady here, and I would say, Mr. Douglass, and you can do it for him, give me a hand. Thank you for all that you did, all that you taught. You have been a great example to all of us. Thank you. I assume that our time is getting close. One last question. Yes, sir. The gentleman looks at me and asks me how old I am. I'm 197 years old this coming Saturday. Thank you all.